Well, this is Ellesmere Port, one of the two Vauxhall plants, worrying, I think it's fair to say, about what's going to happen because the French company, partly state-owned by France, Peugeot-Citroen, PSA, has bought the GM Europe division, and that is in the UK, these two Vauxhall plants. Now, let me just set the scene. 120,000 Vauxhalls made here, Astras, and each one of those cars, out of 100 bits that make that car up, roughly 75 of those bits are brought in from other countries, not made in the UK. And then 8 out of 10 of those 120,000 cars are exported to the European Union. Now, put into that set of maths the idea of tariffs, this fear that there is that once we have left the EU, suddenly we might not have a tariff-free access to the European Union. That means bits coming into this country will cost more because there may well be a tariff. And things going out, like those 8 out of 10 Astras, might have a tariff applied to them. So if you're buying one of these Astras in France, potentially the cost goes right up. And if you think that it's Peugeot-Citroen buying this company, they make cars like Astras. They're making them in the European Union. Will they be cheaper, therefore, than these Astras? John Cooper is a union convener here. You've worked here 40-odd years. That set of figures that I've just given must fill you with dread, doesn't it?
Well, them same set of figures were true 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago with General Motors. We have the same situation today with PSA. With regard to Brexit, Brexit is a concern for us, but it's a separate concern from the one we've been discussing with our members this morning, and that is the acquisition of Opel Vauxhall by PSA.
Just the fact that it's been bought is an issue enough for you?
Well, it's an issue in as much as it raises concerns. It raises many, many questions, but I'm sure in the fullness of time, when we enter genuine negotiations with PSA, all the questions will be answered, and it is our intention to remove all the concerns if indeed we can. And we look forward to working with PSA for a positive future for Ellesmere Port.
So if we just take away that idea of potential tariffs and the problems that will cause, when you were part of GM, what's the difference between being part of GM and being part of a part French-owned company, part French state-owned company that is making cars very similar to the Astra and selling them in Europe?
There is fundamental differences in as much as General Motors is American. PSA, as you've rightly said, is French. There are a number of crossovers between Peugeot's model range and our range, but we have many, many things working in our favour. We produce a car, the Astra, badged as Vauxhall. Vauxhall is an iconic brand in the United Kingdom. It accounts for 10% of the UK market. If Peugeot want to sell cars in this country, having bought Vauxhall-Opel, our message to them is you're going to have to build them here.
So maybe a new factory. Lynn Stokes is asking, does it necessarily mean job losses here, this deal?
Not necessarily at all. While there will be clear synergies between Opel, Vauxhall and PSA, it is our intention that our 2,000 people employed directly here, there are another 7,000 in the supply chain, that's 7,000 people, and 2,000 people here, 9,000 people and their families that depend on this plant being viable for the future. And it's Unite's intention to ensure that this plant remains here for another 50 years, as it has indeed for the last 50 years.
So you've got kind of guarantees for the next 4 years, haven't you? 2021, you're still going to be making this vehicle here. Is that the plan at the moment? We
have a commitment from PSA, a commitment that says quite clearly that they will honour all existing agreements.
And that takes us to 2021?
That takes us to 2021, which is the same position as it was with General Motors. We then need to sit down with Peugeot and discuss a new product being allocated to this plant in 2021, something we would have done with General Motors.
A brutal question just come in. Is it likely that the plants in the UK here in Luton could close?
It's not likely at all. Is it possible? It's possible. Any car plant can close given certain circumstances. But I'll repeat what I said. If PSA want to sell cars in the United Kingdom and vans, they're going to have to keep the United Kingdom plants at Vauxhall's Ellesmere Port and Vauxhall's Luton open building vehicles.
Why though? Because they could argue, well, the tariff of building stuff here because we're only selling 2 out of 10 in the UK, those tariffs, it doesn't add up.
That's why we then send a message out to the government to ensure that the automotive industry in particular and manufacturing in general gets tariff-free access to the European Union.
Ah, now we're getting to the nub.
Absolutely.
So in other words, you're saying that this potential for there to be tariffs is simply, it's not going to work.
Peugeot's position may well be, and again, I'm not second-guessing anything here, and it's difficult and dangerous for me to do so, but it may well be that Peugeot decide to build other models, I don't know, for the UK market at Ellesmere Port. It's something that will only come out in the fullness of time. I'm not saying for 1 minute that that's going to happen. I'm saying it's a possibility.
Because, of course, that is what the people who say they want to take back control, those who are in favour of Brexit would say, that actually this plant is stronger in a fortress Britain. This plant has a better future if we are controlling our own markets, because you'll be able to make cars here more efficiently and you'll be able to sell them in this market because they're made here and they're British.
Well, Brexit and nationalism and protectionism will not take us anywhere. People keep telling me that we can export to Australia and New Zealand. We'd need 10 Australias and 10 New Zealands and then a couple more to have the same impact on exports that we've got with our European counterparts. We will not get a better deal for Brexit than we've got now.
You worked here 40 years. You worked here then, because I'm obviously almost as old as you. You worked here then when British cars had a reputation not for being some of the best in the world, they were some of the worst in the world. I mean, if you look back at the cars that you built 40 years ago, most of them have rusted into nothing and been driven into scrapyards.
I'm not going to argue with that, but the fact of the matter is today we build a car of the highest quality. Let me answer the question.
In a global market?
No, you ask the question, I'll answer it. We build a car of the highest quality to all the build attainments that are asked of us in an economy that's thriving. There's been a renaissance in the UK car manufacturing, and it is Unite's aim to continue that renaissance.
And do you think that the difference between 40 years ago and now is because this plant is part of that global economy and is making things to a world standard? That was the point I was trying to make. Do you think that having a fortress Britain might actually work against the best interests of the market that you're working in?
It may well do. I don't know. I'm not going to second guess what effect Brexit might have, using your words, to create a fortress Britain. It's not something I would get myself involved in. Protectionism can only lead in a downward spiral, because once the UK starts becoming protectionist, then every other country will become protectionist.
Brian Fisher has just said, wait and see, the Luton plant builds vans with Nissan, Renault and Opel badges as well as Vauxhall. Is that right?
That's right.
And in that case, there is already globalisation taking place. There are already vehicles being built with in a kind of pluralistic way, if you like. In other words, that could happen here. There are upsides as well as downsides, aren't there?
Well, that's just what I've just said. There will be positives to the deal, as there may well be negatives, but they will only come out in the fullness of time when we sit down genuinely and discuss it with Peugeot.
Okay, if you've got a question, then just pose it and we will ask John. He is a union convener. He's worked at this plant for 40 years. He's seen a considerable change from the days when the Vauxhall's made here. What was the first car you worked on here? Can you remember?
I can't remember.
You remember what
I haven't
the model...
worked on a car for a long, long time.
Those cars, but it's true, isn't it, that there will be few of those cars that you made 40 years ago that are still around.
If any.
If any, because they simply didn't last, whereas the cars you're making now can last because they're made to different standards.
The cars that come out of this plant, like a whole number of other plants, are all good cars.
So, what's next for Ellesmere Port? Next. You've been speaking to workers today. They're going to have a lot of questions, aren't they? How do you kind of work now to work with those 2,000 people in this plant?
It is our intention, as things progress, through discussions with PSA, to keep our membership informed 100%, and that will take place at more meetings in the future.
This is probably the biggest employer, private employer, in the area, isn't it?
It is. It's the single biggest private employer in the area. As I've said before, it employs 2,000 people directly, another 7,000 in the supply chain. If the plant wasn't here, it would be devastating for a whole number of communities.
But there is, of course, a highly motivated, highly skilled workforce here, and that has a value. If it doesn't have a value for its the new owners of this factory, it has a value for others. Those skills won't just disappear. There will presumably be other people who want the workers here, aren't there?
We've got no intention whatsoever of watching the workforce here be decimated across the region. None whatsoever. It is our intention to maintain the 2,000 direct jobs here at Ellesmere Port.
If you were a betting man, when that 4-year contract runs out, if you like, those commitments up to 2021, final question to you, how do you see this plant in 4 years' time? Is it going to be thriving?
I've got no intention whatsoever of gazing into the future, apart from to say that Unite will fight to make sure that a new product is allocated to Ellesmere Port in 2021, industrially and politically.
Brilliant. John, thank you very much indeed. So the union wants to have a new vehicle being made here when the Astra isn't being made here anymore, but the Astras will be produced here, we are told, for the next 4 years at least. A lot more talking, a lot more meetings to be held.